The hotel was quiet when the cars arrived. It was shortly after 6 in the morning on June 30th, 1934. The men sleeping inside the Hanselbauer Hotel in the Bavarian spa town of Bad Wissy had no reason to expect anything unusual. They had come at the invitation of their leader. They had arrived in good spirits, as men do when they believe they are trusted, when they believe they are valued, when they believe the person summoning them is still the same person they had once marched beside through the streets, with nothing but belief and hunger driving them forward. The doors came off their hinges at 6:30 in the morning. Armed men in dark uniforms flooded the corridors. The guests, senior officers of the most powerful paramilitary force in Germany, were dragged from their beds in their nightclothes. They were thrown against the walls. Not one of them had been given a warning. Not one of them had been charged with anything. And not one of them would survive the weekend. To understand what happened in that hotel, you have to go back to the beginning. Ernst Röhm was not a man you would overlook in a room. He was broad, scarred across the face from the First World War, loud in his opinions, and absolutely fearless in the way that only men who have already faced the worst that the battlefield can offer tend to be. He had met Adolf Hitler in the early 1920s, when both were nobody. Two men circling the edges of a broken, humiliated Germany, looking for something to believe in. They were, by any reasonable measure, close friends. Hitler called him by his first name, one of only a handful of people permitted to do so. And Röhm had done something for Hitler that no amount of speech-making or political maneuvering could have achieved alone. He had built the Sturmabteilung, the SA, known to the world as the Brown Shirts. Starting from almost nothing, Röhm had assembled a paramilitary force that by 1934 numbered nearly 3 million men. 3 million. An army larger than the official German military. An army of working-class men who had marched, intimidated, and fought their way through the years of chaos and opposition. The years that had stood between the movement and power. Without them, the rise to the chancellorship does not happen. Without Röhm, there is no movement to speak of. But power has a way of rewriting gratitude. By early 1934, the SA had become a problem. Not because Röhm had betrayed anyone, not because the SA had done anything wrong, but because 3 million armed and loyal men, following a figure who was not their supreme leader, was, to a man who had just taken control of an entire country, an intolerable situation. The professional military despised the SA. The generals, proud, aristocratic, deeply conservative men who had commanded the Kaiser's armies, looked at the Brown Shirts as a rabble. Rowdy, undisciplined, embarrassing. They made it clear to the new chancellor that if he wanted the military's loyalty and support, the support he would need to do everything he was planning to do, the SA had to be brought to heel. Or eliminated entirely. In April 1934, aboard a German Navy vessel called the Deutschland as it cruised the Baltic Sea, a quiet agreement was reached. The details were never written down, but the terms were simple. Destroy the SA leadership, and the military would support the consolidation of total power. Röhm knew none of this. He was still planning the future. He wanted the SA to become the core of a new German People's Army, to replace the snobbish professional generals with men who had actually lived alongside the people they were supposed to protect. He gave speeches about it. He wrote memorandums about it. He brought these plans to meetings with the generals, who smiled and said nothing. and went back to their offices to report the conversation upward. Meanwhile, two men who had their own reasons to see Rome fall were feeding stories into the one ear that mattered most. Heinrich Himmler, the cold and meticulous head of the SS, had always resented Rome's power over his organization. Hermann Göring, vain and politically ruthless, had his own ambitions that a powerful SA under Rome's command directly threatened. Together, they constructed a case. Reports were gathered, dossiers were assembled, and the claim was made, without real evidence, as it would later become clear, that Rome was planning a coup, that he intended to overthrow the government, that the SA, with its 3 million men, was preparing to move against the very leader it had helped put into power. It was not true, but it did not need to be true. It only needed to be believed by one person. On June 28, Rome received an invitation. He was asked to gather the senior leadership of the SA at a hotel in Bad Wiessee for a conference. It would be a chance, the message implied, to resolve the tensions that had been building, to talk things through, to find a path forward together. Rome passed the invitation along to his officers. They arrived in good spirits, as men do when they believe they are trusted. The night of June 29 passed quietly. Some of the men went to bed early. Others stayed up, talking, drinking, looking forward to the meeting the next morning. None of them slept in their uniforms. None of them kept their sidearms close. Why would they? They had been invited. At 4:30 in the morning on June 30, the order was given simultaneously across Germany. In Munich, in Berlin, in cities and towns across the country. SS units moved to pre-assigned addresses. Lists had been drawn up weeks in advance. Names had been carefully selected. Not just SA leaders, also politicians who had said the wrong thing, former allies who knew too much, critics who had been too visible. A former chancellor, General Kurt von Schleicher, was approached at his front door. He was eliminated there. His wife, who happened to be standing beside him, was eliminated as well. A man named Gregor Strasser, once the second most powerful figure in the entire movement, was taken to a cell in the Gestapo headquarters in Berlin. He had shaped the movement's ideology and built its northern support base. He was silenced in that cell. The body was left on the floor. By the time most of Germany woke up on the morning of June 30, 1934, somewhere between 150 and 400 people had already been eliminated. The exact number has never been confirmed. At the hotel in Bad Wiessee, Ernst Röhm was placed under arrest by the leader he had served for more than a decade. He was taken to Stadelheim prison in Munich. For one day, he sat in his cell and waited. And then, on July 1st, an SS officer entered the cell. He placed a loaded firearm on the small wooden table without speaking. Röhm was given a choice: use it himself, or they would do it for him. He refused. He said, according to those present, that if he was to be eliminated, his leader would have to give the order directly and take responsibility for it. The order was given. Röhm was silenced in his cell on July 1, 1934. He was 46 years old. When it was over, the regime needed a story. The propaganda apparatus, led by Joseph Goebbels, went to work. The public was told that Rome had been planning a violent overthrow of the government, that the swift action of the previous days had saved Germany from chaos and civil war, that what had happened was not a mass elimination of loyal men without trial. It was an act of decisive,
necessary leadership. Most people believed it. President Paul von Hindenburg, elderly and days from his own death, sent a telegram of congratulations. The military leadership expressed gratitude.
The cabinet declared the eliminations legal after the fact on July 3rd. And in a speech to the Reichstag on July 13, the leader stood before the assembled parliament of Germany. He declared himself, in those exact words, the administrator of justice of the German people. No one challenged him. No one walked out. When Hindenburg passed away on August 2, 1934, just 5 weeks after the purge, the military, as agreed, threw its full support behind merging the offices of Chancellor and President into a single role. One man, one title, absolute authority over every branch of the German state. The men who had built the movement and handed its leader the tools of power had been removed. The men who remained had sworn personal loyalty directly to one individual. The deal made quietly on a cruise ship in the Baltic 4 months earlier had been fulfilled. What the Night of the Long Knives teaches us is not simply a lesson about one regime or one moment in one country's history. It is a lesson about the mechanics of absolute power, how it is achieved not through great battles or dramatic confrontations, but through the quiet, careful, systematic removal of anyone who might one day say, "I remember when you needed us." Ernst Röhm had built the machine that carried his closest friend to the highest office in the land. And the moment the machine was no longer needed, the moment loyalty became a liability instead of an asset, it was switched off. In a single night, without warning, without trial, without a single public voice raised in protest. That silence, that complete, total, unbroken silence from an entire nation, was not the final chapter of the story. It was the moment the real story began.